so engaged in activity that you lose track of time for a little while. You don't really know what happened when you're looking back on it, but you think that you were kind of productive. I'm not talking about this weekend. I'm talking about flow state, which is a concept that talks about the idea of when you're engaged in an activity and your brain is in a hyper-productive state that helps you get a lot of things done and you kind of lose track of time. I've been accessing flow since I was a kid, and I hadn't really realized what it was until I started it showed up on a podcast, and so I watched this podcast, and I was like, oh my gosh, I think I've been using this since I was a kid. It started when I would play with my dolls in my room, and I would make up stories, and next thing I know, 5 hours had gone by, and I had this whole elaborate storyline laid out. And then later, it was in art when I would just kind of start creating my art pieces, and then hours would go by, and I would have this masterpiece in front of me, and time would just fly by, and I didn't really know how I had gotten to the current point. So today I'm going to be talking to you guys a little bit more in detail about flow and how you can access it and why it's important to be able to use it. So flow was first coined by a guy named Csikszentmihalyi, and his book Flow, which described flow as being in the zone or losing track of time or getting lost in the moment. So the concept was first discovered with an artist and creative people like musicians and journalists because once they would start practicing whatever it was that they were doing, they would kind of lose track of time and just dive deep into this hyper-productive state where they would just get a bunch of stuff done. So I don't know if you guys have experienced anything like that with things that you have been doing, but it's very possible that you have. Flow is experienced by people who dive deep into whatever they're doing and their brain kind of goes into autopilot. Experiencing flow while viewing art, author Finley Wanzar mentions that flow state is something that is a universal concept, so it's recognized by people all across the world. People who are educators, who are creative minds have been using this theory and kind of been exploring it more recently because it's kind of been shown to be a powerful thing that people can tap into in their own minds. So flow is not only just a mental concept, it also has physical reflections. So in a study conducted by Bulgara Vilamira, where flow was demonstrated in the form of using social media, people experience flow in a state where they experience flow and then their breath rate, their heart rate, and their pupil dilation is recorded. So as you can see, when people were engaged in Facebook and experiencing flow state, their heart rate was somewhere in between relaxed and stressed, which means that it's kind of like a balance in between your brain is working just hard enough to be engaged, but it's not hyper stressed. So it's kind of like a relaxing state that you're in where you're able to engage. An article titled Towards a Unified Modeling of Learner's Growth Process, Kaiser-Chalko studies the relationship between education and flow state and talks about how students who are engaged in flow can optimize their learning and soak in the most information from the instructor. So flow is a super important concept in the educational world, and it's something that's growing, and people are kind of looking more into it in the educational world because it can help students learn. So how can you access flow, and what can it do for you? I watched a podcast with Joe Rogan. I don't know if you guys have watched his stuff before, but he interviewed a guy named Stephen Coulter, who's a journalist and an author. Coulter wrote an entire book about flow state, and he's been studying it for a number of years now. And he talked about how he taps into flow state and how he can get into it super frequently. And he says that normally it comes late at night when he feels like nobody else is awake and he's the only one up, or early in the morning when, same thing, he's the only one awake. And he feels like he just has certain times of day that optimize his ability to get into flow. He also said that Coulter was writing a journal, and the first half of the journal that he wrote, he was not in flow, and he just wrote it, kind of forced himself to write it, and he sent it to the editor sent it back to him, and it had all kinds of errors, he almost had to rewrite this whole half of his book. And then the second half of the book, he sat down, and it was super late at night, and he got into flow, and he said he wrote for almost 12 hours straight, and he, cranked out this entire half of a book, and then he turned it back into the editor, and the editor told him it was perfect. He didn't have any typos, any errors, nothing. So when he was in flow, he found that his mind was way more engaged and almost flawless. It was creating flawless content when he was engaged in flow. So during this podcast, The two talk about how the consumption of drugs can also trigger flow state. So some people artificially trigger flow by consuming drugs. This can be psychedelics, Adderall, marijuana. Those kinds of things can trigger flow state, but it's not necessarily a super authentic type. So obviously taking drugs consistently to access flow is not super good for your body or mind. And drugs often come with side effects that can alter the effectiveness of flow state if you are using it to tap into flow. And then we also see flow when we are using our phones. So like in this study done, they found that when you're using your phone, that's another way you can access flow. So it's the combination of the actual light coming into our eyes and our brain processing the light, as well as the when you're using Facebook, your brain isn't working super hard, but it's still working hard enough to process information, and you're getting positive feedback. So your brain actually adapts and connects to flow super quickly when you're using social media like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and that's why we become addicted to these things, because it's so easy for our mind to just flow into these social media platforms and kind of get us attached to them. So those are some ways that you can access flow, and I mean you can use the technology for better or for worse, but I always try to make it kind of meaningful in things that I'm passionate about, so art, school, and with school, our educators are now moving towards using flow to, like I said, maximize learning potential in students. Kaiser Chalco mentions in his article Towards a Unified Modeling of Learners' Growth Process that one condition for attaining and maintaining flow state is a good balance between perceived challenge of task and the participant's own perceived abilities to solve it. So this basically means that when you're given an assignment, you need to know that the assignment is doable, one, but also challenging enough to not make you bored. So educators have to find this kind of flow channel between too hard and too easy, and also attainable. So this is kind of a new thing that has been studied and has been written about, but it's essentially finding this sweet spot that's a channel where kids can flow and actually pick up information, and that's the most effective way to learn. So I hope that I've convinced you that flow is a pretty cool thing that our minds can do, and that with some practice and or drug use, if you do choose to do so, you can use flow to do things that you're passionate about. So lose track of time, get in the zone, and do some cool things. Thank you.